My baby dolls, we're back again. Another episode of Genesis is coming up, and we got another great show coming out for you here. We are sitting with Jason Turbow. He's on the phone, and his brand new book on those Swingin' A's with Charlie Finley and Company, Dynastic, Bombastic, Fantastic, Reggie, Rollie, Catfish, and Charlie Finley's Swinging A's. And the time machine is going back into the 60s and 70s today, and we're going to have a great time because I love this book. Even before Jason comes on the show, we'll discuss Jason, and we'll give a little synopsis of the book before he makes his appearance. But this is a great book, folks. You got to go out. You got to get it because it really does justice to a subject that is, you know, in many respects has been long forgotten. And my thing is, you know, and we'll ask Jason about it, it's like, why would you forget a team that wins 5 Western Division titles and wins 3 pennants and wins 3 World Series? I mean, even the 74 Dodgers underestimated a 2-time champion, and we'll go into that scenario as well. But, you know, you think of the Big Red Machine, and again, the Oakland A's played them in 1972, the whole hair versus squares ordeal. You know, you think of the Bronx Zoo, and Catfish Hunter and Reggie Jackson was on that team, and later on, Campaneris, I think, came to the Yankees. He was in his 40s. But why do we forget the Oakland A's? We're going to find out. And, of course, it's all here. And, as always, I am your host, Ian Kahanowitz, and you are listening to the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network. Got a lot of great shows. You know, we do Giants baseball, both New York and San Francisco. Every week I do it with the producer, the zigzag man himself, Ralph Tycho. I have a lot of fun doing that. I also do Oakland A's baseball occasionally when called upon. And, of course, I am on the David Nemec's show, David Nemec's Old Time Baseball and Trivia. And we are with Alan Blumpkin, who is the, you know, I always call him the historian of historian. That's Saber. So, you know, a lot of good stuff is on the network. We got Mike and Mike in the midday, and, of course, that's Mark Littell. And he's the one who gave up the home run, coincidentally, to the Kansas City A's in 1976. Gave it up to Chris Chambliss, and that was the first year that Oakland really wasn't in the championship game to go to a World Series since 1970. So we have a lot of great stuff on the network, and now we're going to turn to the book. And the book, you know, like I said, I can't give enough. I mean, out of a possible 5 stars, it's definitely a 5-star read. You know, Jason makes it very, very reader-friendly. His writing style's fresh, and I really enjoyed learning about all the guys you grow up with, you know, stuff maybe I didn't know, the fights, the whole Charlie Finley aura of his narcissistic personality, and Sal Bando, and names I knew as a little kid. I mean, I remember Rollie just barely on the A's. I remember him more with Milwaukee and later San Diego and stuff like that. And Sal Bando I remember on just barely on the A's and when he was traded to Milwaukee. And, of course, Reggie Jackson and Catfish Hunter were a fixture in me growing up in Brooklyn. And this book really details the stuff that make these players and what they did in their personal lives, the brawls in the dugout, the brawls with Finley. I mean, it's an exciting time of baseball. It really changed baseball. And, of course, author Jason Turbow is the author of the best-selling The Baseball Codes, Beanballs, Sign Stealing, and Bench Clearing Brawls, The Unwritten Rules of America's Pastime. He has written for the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and SportsIllustrated.com, and, of course, he is in California. Welcome to the show, Jason. How are you, sir?
I'm doing great. Thank you for having me on, Ian.
This is, you know, I waited for this. I mean, I contacted you months, and after I read the book, I said, I can't wait to do this show. Dynastic, Bombastic, Fantastic. How did you come up with such a name?
That was a hell of an introduction, by the way.
Really?
Excellent work.
You like this? Hey, you know, I am colorful. I'm just as colorful as these days. I think I'd be like Billy North and Reggie Jackson rolling on the floor, and the Fosse would have to come over and break it up. I'd be jumping right in there with them.
Yeah, there you go. I'm a big fan of superlatives.
Oh, yeah.
The name, this is actually the name I sold the pitch with. I never thought it would stick. I just tried to make it lively enough for a publisher to be interested. But it turns out they liked it well enough that they kept it. We never came up with anything better. And I think it serves the topic well. They were bombastic. This is the loudest, most in-your-face team in baseball. And the fact that they were enduring, I mean, they really, you talk about transformative. This team dragged baseball from the sport we picture in the late 1950s to the sport we picture in the late 1970s, with the polyester and the crazy colors and the facial hair, even the white spikes, and their style of play. I tried to find a title that reflected that, and hopefully I succeeded on that front.
And it really did change baseball's look. I mean, you look at the 50s and early 60s, and everyone has that crew cut, and everyone's looking like, Mickey Mantle, and everyone's looking like Roger Maris, clean shaven, clean haircuts. And now, all of a sudden, Reggie Jackson shows up one day. I think, when was it, in 71 or was it 72?
72.
Yeah, and then everyone decides to grow a mustache and get the shag look. How did that come about?
Yeah, this is a great story behind it, because Reggie did show up in spring training with this full mustache, which wasn't so unusual. I mean, guys made habit of growing off-season beards, but they always shaved them before the season started. And Roy Campanella made it a rite of spring training to shave his beard every year. But Reggie wasn't about to shave. And it wasn't even the team owner, Charlie Finley, who disliked the look. It was his own teammates. And, Reggie is Reggie. He's got the biggest ego in whatever room he's in. They couldn't convince him to shave. And so they hatched a plan, which was to grow their own mustaches, which would draw a blanket rebuke from management, and owner Charlie Finley would in turn command the lot of them to shave. But what they never expected was that Finley would be thunderstruck by this. And the guy was a promotional maverick. There was no promotion that didn't tickle his fancy. He tried it all. I mean, the previous season he had staged hot pants night at the ballpark, wherein they expected a few hundred women to participate in this contest. It's like 6,000 women, something like that, showed up and stormed the field. The Oakland Tribune called it a stampede created by Hugh Hefner. So Finley loved this kind of stuff. And as soon as he saw the mustaches on the faces, he decreed that any player who had his own mustache in place by June 18th, the date of the team photo, would get a $300 bonus. To which pitcher Ken Holtzman responded, "For $300, I will grow hair on my feet." And sure enough, the whole team was adorned on June 18th, and that happened to be Father's Day. So Finley turned it into a Mustache Day promotion, wherein mustachioed men got discounted admission to the ballpark. And it was a thing. I mean, it's easy to forget that baseball had an unofficial facial hair ban, like, dating back to the early part of the century. Like, there had been no mustaches or beards seen virtually across the entire sport for 50 years. And so this was revolutionary. And when later that season the A's made it to the World Series against the very clean-cut Cincinnati Reds, the Reds were so clean-cut that they had erased the old-timey mustache from their mascot, Mr. Red. That's how clean-cut they were. It became known as the Hares versus the Squares. And the Hares, Oakland, won in 7. And that kind of set the table for a sartorial revolution in baseball over the coming years.
Well, let me ask you this. You know what's interesting? In October 1972, Sparky Anderson, who looked about 90 then, he was only 35. I mean, he had the gray hair and everything. He spoke about the preparation for the World Series, and he wanted the Tigers to win because he saw that in the Oakland A's they were so unpredictable. He didn't know what to think of it. What did you find in your research about Sparky's thought process about this?
Well, I mean, it's kind of the enemy you know, right? The Tigers were a huge team. They were an extremely powerful team, and they played straightforward baseball. The A's, I mean, Dick Williams was an unpredictable manager. He was very aggressive. He did like to run, although, to be fair, I think the Reds played even more aggressively than the A's. They had a great hit and run game. So to consider the A's the wild bunch of that group, at least on the field, is not entirely accurate. But the A's did so many things so well and could hurt you in so many different ways that it only makes sense to kind of wish you were playing a team that was, even if it was just as talented, was a little bit more predictable.
And you know something? I think in the American League Championship Series, I mean, everyone sees this team. They're dressed in their gold and green and the white spikes and all this. But then, you get Campaneris, and he throws the bat at Tigers pitcher Laron LeGros. Does that add to the image? These guys are like hippies, man. They're like antisocial.
Campaneris was a beauty. I mean, he was a little dude. He was like 5'10" and weighed $160, and he never really liked contact. This is something I heard from his middle infield companions. When they were feeding him the ball over second base when he was turning a double play, he needed that ball quick so he could get out of there. He did not enjoy contact. He was perpetually harangued by accusations that he milked his time on the disabled list. He never came back quite as quickly as his teammates thought he should. But that said, he was a spark plug. He was the thing that made the A's go at the top of the order. He was incredibly fast. He led the league in steals, I think, 6 times. He could get on base with the best of them. He was a fiery player, but the lack of contact came into play in this incident you're talking about. Laron LeGros hit him in the ankle very intentionally, to the point where he ended up on crutches, Campaneris. And it was a serious incident. Campaneris wanted to charge the mound, but he realized that LeGros is something like 6'5". Campaneris wanted no part of that, so instead he just reared back and threw his bat at the mound. Which I mean, I don't know how familiar you are with the history of bat tossing in baseball. It's not exactly a rich and storied tradition, but it's hard to aim a bat when you throw it 60 feet away from you. Campaneris had it right on line. It helicoptered right above LeGros' head, and the guy had to duck down to avoid it. A scary moment, and Campaneris ended up suspended for the duration of the playoffs, which was unnecessary since he was probably not going to play anyway, at least for the next couple games, with his injured ankle. And ultimately, Commissioner Bowie Kuhn realized that to deprive the A's of Campaneris in the World Series would be unfair, especially since Reggie Jackson had also been injured in a play. So he commuted the sentence to the next season, and Campaneris was suspended for 7 games to start 1973.
And I was going to talk about the Reggie getting injured, and how did the A's improvise regarding losing their superstar?
Well, it wasn't easy. I mean, Reggie's the best player on the team by far. I mean, their most capable player offensively, the only offensive player to make the Hall of Fame on that team. And they struggled. I mean, Mike Epstein had come over in a trade and had done a great job at first base, batting behind Reggie, but without Reggie in the lineup, he got elevated to the cleanup spot and struggled. And he got 1 hit in the playoffs, and I think he went 0 for the World Series. And it was terrible. The A's really struggled to replace him whenever he was out. And Reggie's, the one downside of Reggie, well, I guess there's numerous downsides, but the glaring downside was that his hamstrings were so taut that they ended up injured constantly. Like he was always trying to temper his hamstrings. So they replaced him frequently, and they never managed to do a very good job of it.
And besides being a player that has been criticized not only by the A's, but Billy Martin had a fight with Reggie that he wasn't hustling. I remember that day they were up in Finley and on live TV. He pulled him from right field, and he was pulled a few times with Oakland as well for not hustling. Do you think Reggie didn't hustle as they say, or do you think it was misconception by the managers?
Reggie knew how to go all out for sure, but the guy was surprisingly sensitive. When he got into personal conflicts with teammates off the field or with management, it ate him up, and it really affected his play on the field. So I think part of what's seen as a lack of hustle is really just Reggie being in his head to the point where he's not reacting as instinctively as he might otherwise. I mean, there was a play when he got into it with Dick Williams in 1973. He started criticizing management overtly. He was so lost as he was on first base leading off that the Royals catcher, Fran Healy, I believe, literally ran him down and tagged him out off of first base himself. He ran out from behind the plate. Like, Reggie really could get up in his own head and struggled because of it. So I think, there's definitely the idea that he played when he wanted to play. And, there was a great play in the 74 World Series where Billy North made an error in center field, let a ball get underneath his glove, and Reggie was right there to back it up. And the only way he would be there is if he was sprinting from the outset. So it's not like the guy never hustled. But, yeah, he did have his moments of lackadaisical play.
And, you spoke about, Reggie and being very sensitive. And, that was beautiful. You read my mind because I wanted to talk about it. Now, in 69, he had a monster season. He had 47 home runs, and he was on pace to break Roger Maris. And, of course, it was only 8 years before. But in the offseason, he wanted a salary increase, and, of course, the reserve clause was still in effect. And Finley wants to send it to the minors, and this affected Reggie terribly for that year in 1970.
Oh, yeah. I mean, Reggie, not unreasonably, said, well, I'm baseball's brightest star. Like, he exploded onto the scene that year. And held out for a salary increase. And this is, Charlie Finley is the biggest character in my book for a variety of reasons, but he influenced everything that happened. And his one abiding character trait was that he wanted to be right about everything all the time. And he would set a line in the sand, demarking what he thought was appropriate, and damn if anyone could get him to cross it. So when he made what he felt was a fair offer to Reggie, he wasn't budging. And, Reggie demanded a pretty big salary, and slowly over the course of the spring, back down incrementally, a little at a time, while Finley did not move at all. Finally, I think Finley was offering $45,000. Finally, Reggie said, here's the deal. Give me $1,000 for every homer I hit last year, which was just like an increase of a couple grand over what Finley was offering. He thought it could save face for both of them. It would be an easy way out. And Finley essentially said, no, you're playing on my terms or you're not playing. And it wrecked Reggie. He had a terrible season to the point that he started to be benched against left-handers. He started to be benched against right-handers also. And like you said, Finley threatened to send him to the minors. He actually had the manager ask Reggie, could you go down for a couple weeks just to straighten yourself out? Which is totally inappropriate. Finley actually ended up being fined by Bowie Kuhn for that, for using the minors as a punitive method or measure rather than a development tool. And it effectively wrecked Reggie's season. And he of course came back and had a splendid career. But man, that it showed that Finley cared more about being right than he did about winning, because he could have satisfied his best player with very little effort. And this scenario played itself out many times over the years, most notably with Vida Blue's holdout in 1972. But it's weird. A guy like Finley, who cared so much about winning, and he put a lot of money into the team, cared more about being right, actually, than he did even about winning.
And that narcissistic personality helped bring down the downfall later. I think you, in the book, if I recall correctly, because I read it about a month and a half ago, he's sitting on a bench, Finley, with Reggie. And for some reason, he's feeling remorse because he knows Reggie's going to leave and go to Baltimore and stuff. Do you think he was really remorseful after he saw the consequences of his actions? Yeah.
I mean, this happened repeatedly. I mean, a noteworthy moment that had nothing to do with Reggie came in 1967 when the team was in Kansas City. There was a series of events that turned the team and manager Alvin Dark against Finley, which culminated in outfielder Ken Harrelson being quoted as calling Finley a menace to baseball. And this was reported, across the country. Finley's response was to cut Harrelson very rashly, immediately. He just cut him, despite the fact that Harrelson was the team's best hitter. Harrelson at first was really upset by that, but within a day realized that the $12,000 he was making from Charlie Finley was going to be dwarfed by whatever he ended up making from the team that signed him. He ended up signing with the Red Sox for $150,000. And as soon as Finley realized, oh my gosh, this is happening, he called Harrelson, tried to apologize, tried to get him back on the team, and of course it was too late. I mean, he did the same thing with Catfish Hunter when Catfish Hunter was made a free agent because Finley messed up that contract. He tried to retroactively, get him back. And too little, too late seems to be the story of his life in that regard. But yeah, I think he realized ex post facto that he could be a little too rash for his own good.
Now, let me ask you this. He was in insurance up in Chicago for many years, and he was very successful in insurance. Did you find any research that he treated the people who worked with him and for him the same way he treated his baseball team?
I didn't find any of that. And there's not a lot of people around from his insurance days that are easy to find, so it's not like I got heavy into it. But I did ask those who were on the scene, and I didn't find that. And it's interesting because he was a personable guy, and he was a friendly guy. And those who did not work for him and those who did not rely on him found him to be charming and delightful. It's when he had power over you that things got terrible in a hurry. Like he squashed so much joy out of his team. I mean, when Vida Blue was on his way to winning the MVP and Cy Young awards in 1971, Finley wanted the stories to be about Finley, not about Vida Blue. And his PR guy managed to get Vida on the cover of a couple major magazines and got chastised because it wasn't Finley on the cover. I mean, his priorities were nuts. It never really lined up. So I would imagine that things happen in his insurance industry, but no, I don't have any firm answers to that.
Let me ask you this. He's up in Chicago, okay? He attempted to buy the A's in 1954, but the American League owners gave it to Arnold Johnson. Then Johnson dies in 1960, and then Finley was able to buy that. Now, again, he has no ties to Kansas City. Why didn't he try to go after the Cubs or the White Sox instead?
Oh, he did. He put in bids for numerous teams, including the White Sox. The White Sox went to Bill Veck's syndicate. Finley actually tried to buy into the syndicate with Veck, and Veck realized that he could not deal with this guy having any sort of say in his ball club. I mean, Finley was his own kind of showman. He was always considered to be another Bill Veck in that regard. Veck wanted no part of him, so he aced him out. I mean, Finley tried to buy the Tigers. He tried to buy the California Angels when they came into existence, and it was a combination of either not having enough money in his bid or not having enough connections within baseball or not having enough savvy in knowing how to introduce himself appropriately to the process. And finally, it was he had bid for the A's before Arnold Johnson bought them. Like he had been beaten out by Arnold Johnson. It turns out Arnold Johnson was a baseball insider. He actually owned Yankee Stadium and then leased it back to the Yankees owners. So his getting the team over Finley was a no-brainer. But when he died, they needed to sell the team quickly because Johnson's widow had estate taxes and whatnot to pay. So Finley purchased 40-something% of the team, and the rest was purchased by a Kansas City syndicate that Finley quickly aced out over the next year or so and took over sole ownership.
And with Johnson, the big joke was that the Kansas City A's or the farm team to the New York Yankees, for the reasons you've just stated. Why was Charlie Finley so determined to get rid of that? They won't do any dealing with the Yankees and to build this team, right from scratch, pretty much.
Yeah, well, you're absolutely right. Johnson was effectively in bed with the Yankees ownership, and part of the deal to buy Yankee Stadium included his buying the ballpark in Kansas City. And financially, it worked out. He sent all his best players to New York for whatever spare parts they had to offer. There was this, the most egregious moment. They had the bonus baby rule back then, right? So if you signed an amateur player in the days before the draft for a certain amount of money, you had to keep him on the major league roster for 2 years. Like this was designed as a deterrent for teams just to go out and spend willy-nilly. So he signed Clete Boyer, third baseman, sat on the A's bench for 2 seasons. Like the very next month after his 2 seasons were up, he traded him to the Yankees for next to nothing. The Yankees immediately farmed him out and proceeded apace. Like he did the Yankees' biddings, and to Charlie Finley's credit, he wanted no part of that. Like it was an obvious collusion. Major League Baseball was looking the other way because they understood the value of a powerhouse franchise in New York. But Finley was not going to abide that. He actually bought an old bus, pointed it toward New York, and set it on fire as a symbolic stance that the practices of the Arnold Johnson administration would theretofore end.
And you know something? That's going to lead me into this segue here. He was a showman, Charlie. And you know something? I always write on my baseball sites, if you're ever in my broadcasting site or my other sites, he was the master showman. What are some of the things he did in Kansas City to get people into the ballpark?
I mean, my favorite thing he did actually wasn't even baseball related. He, in 1964, because his daughters were fans of this up-and-coming young rock band called the Beatles,
that's right,
he negotiated to get the Beatles to play in Kansas City's Municipal Stadium. And I mean, it's nuts. They made like $25,000 a concert at the time. He offered their manager $50,000 and was turned down. He offered their manager $100,000 and was turned down. Finally, $150,000 got the Beatles to play in Kansas City. Charlie Finley promoted them with his own name on top. I mean, Charles O. Finley presents the Beatles in concert. The picture on the ticket was of Finley wearing a Beatles wig. Yet somehow he had alienated that population so thoroughly. Like he perpetually threatening to move the team. He fought with the city fathers. He fought with the press. He fought with everybody. He was so disliked in Kansas City that was the only stop on the Beatles' entire tour to fail to sell out, and they only sold about half the tickets. The lasting good that came out of it, if Charlie Finley had an impact on popular culture outside of baseball, was that for that one show, the Beatles played a Kansas City Hey, 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 Hey medley that was made popular by Little Richard that actually ended up on a record the next year, Beatles 6. So he had that going for him. But I think it was really illustrative about Finley's ambitions, kind of counterbalanced by his lack of perception about how he would come off about everything. It always played against each other like that.
You know, he was such an innovator. And, you know, when you read the book, and I couldn't agree with you more, it's bittersweet when you think of Charlie Finley, because he comes into baseball. Let's look at it this way. I'll give you a new perspective, unless you've thought about this before. He comes into baseball and isn't liked by the owners, and he's considered a radical. But when free agency comes and everything, now he's considered an old chestnut that doesn't want to change in the era of free agency. He doesn't want to go this route. He's considered like the old times, but he really wasn't. And he did so much innovations to get people the zoo. The zoo. They had
the petting zoo in right field. Yeah.
Yeah, and then they had the rabbit over there pop up, but the orange ball. I don't know why it never took with the American League. The DH did. That was also Finley's idea. But why that orange ball were they so against? And they even played a game with it.
Yeah, they played a couple of spring training games with it. A couple of reasons. Well, I mean, the big picture is that Finley was so unpopular among ownership ranks that any idea he put forth was already on poor footing based on the fact that it came from his mouth, right? So whatever he said was automatically a step or two behind anybody else. The orange ball was his brainchild. He never stopped pushing the orange baseball. He called it Alert Orange, was the name for the color. And he made up a bunch of them on his own, and he convinced baseball to try them in some spring training games. There were a couple problems with the ball. One was that in the limited production he put together, the ball was dyed, not tanned, meaning that the surface cracked upon impact. It was not a terrific baseball functionally. And with production methods, when you make it in mass for Major League Baseball, that could have been corrected. The other was that it was difficult to pick up the seams out of the pitcher's hand, what with red seams and an orange ball. And hitters had a hard time. I mean, picking up the rotation is a giant part of hitting. And even the guys, and after one spring training game, I think George Hendrick hit 3 home runs with the orange ball, and after the game, he didn't like it. One of the players on the Indians said they should take the orange ball, wrap it in a blue blanket, and drop it in the Red Sea. So people generally didn't like it. That never stopped Finley. He never stopped trying to use it. He actually wheedled his way into using it in extra spring training games, and insisting he had the permission from the commissioner when no such thing had been granted. It was just another way of him getting his way, despite any possible fallout. And there was that. He wanted color-coded bases. He tried to get 3-ball walks implemented. He got that implemented in spring training also, which was another disaster. 19 walks and a bunch of home runs, and the game slowed down immeasurably. No one liked it, but he continually tried pushing these crazy ideas. But that said, like you say, he had some good ones, and he was the most prominent voice in favor of the designated hitter. Whether or not you think that's a good idea, it's a viable idea at least. He got baseball to begin weekday World Series games at night, so the working man might be better able to tune in. He got them to begin World Series on Saturdays rather than Wednesdays to maximize weekend viewing. He had a bunch of good ideas that were enacted, but people remember the bad ones because they were so much crazier.
And with Finley, again, he's an insurance. He pretty much handles the team by himself as general manager. He didn't have any great baseball knowledge. How did he build this team?
Yeah, that's a great point. He wasn't a baseball guy beyond kind of the fan level. He loved the sport, but he didn't have a scout's eye. He didn't know how to evaluate talent. What he had was this innate salesmanship. That's how he made his millions. He effectively invented group insurance rates for medical professionals and built an empire on it. And he could stay on the phone for hours every day, like literally hours. And he would call people across the landscape of baseball. He would call fellow executives and general managers and scouts and whatever kind of personnel folk he could get hold of, frequently in the guise of trade talks. And he would collect assessments about his own players and about the other team's players and about unrelated players around the league. And when he was talking to lower level people, they frequently took it as de facto job interviews, and they would give up the goods from their organization. And he kept detailed notes, and he would collect assessments on all these players, and he would use that to inform his decisions. And I mean, Finley was his primary virtue was a willingness to outwork everybody, and he really did. The guy barely slept. He never stopped moving. So I was thinking about this. I'm trying to think about how many trades an average team makes a season. And as best I could figure, maybe 2 or 3, if that. In 1972, Charlie Finley made 62 trades during the course of the one season, to the point where Dick Williams, the manager, said his best method for finding out who was on the team at any given moment was just to go to the ballpark and see who showed up. So Finley, his personal motto was sweat plus sacrifice equals success, and he lived it. If there was a genius to that methodology, it was that he left his core guys alone. And all the players you think of when you think of those A's, Reggie and Rollie and Catfish and Bando and Rudy and Vida and Tennis, all those guys were there for the whole run. And Finley's tinkering was at the edges, and it was incessant. But even the bad moves, and there were plenty of bad moves, didn't end up hurting the team too badly.
And you traveled a lot to interview these guys, including Dick Williams before he died. You had such a collection of stories. How did you decipher what was true, what was not true? There's a lot of stories here.
That's a good question. I need to correct you, though. Dick Williams died many years before this book. I interviewed his son, Rick Williams, who is still in baseball. He's a scout with the Atlanta Braves, which was, I guess the next best thing. But your point is terrific because I had some amazing stories told to me, like jaw-dropping, dramatic stories that just didn't really line up with what everyone else was seeing. And, we're talking about 40-year-old memories here. So, of course, and even the journalists I talked to gave me some stories that they insisted were accurate that were clearly not. And not for any reason other than the fact they were remembering them wrong. And so, I would have this clubhouse incident that was, somewhat reported in the media after the fact that I would get 8 opinions on and 8 sets of details, and every set of details contradicted the other ones. So it was just a matter of finding out what was most easily corroborated. And I had to leave a lot of stuff, on the cutting room floor just because it wasn't certain that it was true. So ultimately I tried to tell the truest story I could.
And something, it's so hard because me being an attorney, I wouldn't, put the stuff out unless I knew the facts and do the deep sea. You did research. It took you, 3 years overall to do all the research and all the interviews and actually sit down and write this book?
Yeah, about somewhere between 2 and 3 years. But, that's the fun part. I spent a whole winter traveling the country talking to these guys. And Dick Green took me to Mount Rushmore in South Dakota, near where he lived, and I saw Rollie outside of Las Vegas where he lives, and up in Oregon, Rudy and Tennis live up there, and Billy North in Seattle. It was amazing to just travel and spend so much time with these guys and get all the stories. And even when the stories didn't really line up, there was always the genesis was truthful. Even if the details were a little bit fuzzy. So I got some great insights into this team, and I really think looking back that Reggie Jackson aside, and maybe Rollie Fingers, these guys' legacies is really just tied up with the Oakland A's. As they're remembered as ball players, they're remembered as A's, and this team's historical standing, it hasn't been appropriate, right? This is not remembered as one of the best teams ever. It's barely remembered at all, and that's one of my goals in writing this book is that, holy cow, this team was transformative, and it's the only team other than the Yankees ever to win 3 straight championships, and it's got 3 Hall of Famers, and it's got an amazing supporting cast, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I think these guys realized that in their legacies as A's, because the A's are so underserved in the historical record, that means they're underserved. And they knew my point, my purpose in writing this book, and I think that helped them open up with a lot of the truth of the situation.
And what's very funny? You're a Giants fan. I did my homework on you, and of course people don't know, or maybe if you lived through the time, Vita Blue was traded in 1911. Mm-hmm. I think he won the MVP, and he started the All-Star game for the National League. My thing is this. I'm going to twist the question here a little bit because I think it's important. Is there a rivalry between Oakland and San Francisco with as much hatred as, say, Yankees, Mets, White Sox, Cubs, Red Sox, Yankees, Dodgers, Giants? Is there that kind of, wow, or is Oakland just because they never took on in Oakland? I think that's one of the reasons why they've forgotten. Their attendance was awful, even when they were winning. But do you think that there's this huge rivalry there between the Bay Area teams?
No, there's not. It's not Red Sox Yankees at all. The Giants have the Dodgers. That's their closest counterpoint to Red Sox Yankees. No, there's just not. Even when the A's moved here, the Giants were terrible. Neither team was drawing very much. The A's were much better. Now it's the Giants winning World Series and selling out their beautiful ballpark, while the A's struggle to reach 10,000 a game in their crummy old Coliseum. I don't think the fan bases really pay that much attention. If anything, it's the A's fans being resentful for everything the Giants have. which, as a lifelong Giants fan growing up in the 70s and 80s, I was resentful toward the Dodgers because the Dodgers were winning all the time. The Giants were terrible. And so I hated the Dodgers for it. And I think that dynamic might be going on, but it's not really a rivalry per se.
And you know what's funny? A lot of people don't notice. The Giants were not as good. They were getting old and stuff, but they could have been a Bay Area World Series in '71. Pittsburgh beat the Giants. That was the only year I think the Giants won the division, the Western Division. They played, and of course the Baltimore Orioles played the A's, and so they could have been a Bay Area World Series before 1989 because that's how good those teams were in those.
Yeah.
Why didn't baseball catch on even when the A's caught fire in the late 60s, early 70s?
A lot of reasons. And it's people say it's too cold at night. The Coliseum was vast and wet, and there's too many other distractions in the Bay Area. But I think the biggest reason was that Charlie Finley never insinuated himself into the East Bay community. And it happened when he bought the A's in Kansas City. He promised to move his family to Kansas City. He never did. And thus the Kansas City community ended up rebelling against him for a variety of reasons. He bought no goodwill there. When he moved the team to Oakland, he said, hey, I bought the team in Kansas City. That wasn't my choice. Moving here is my choice. I'm moving out. I'm in Oakland to stay. I'm true blue right here. He never moved out. He stayed in Chicago. He visited a couple times a year, if that. And made no effort to integrate the team into the social fabric. And the quick and easy comparison is to look at the team that shared the field with them in the Oakland Coliseum, the Oakland Raiders of the NFL. Al Davis was all about Oakland through the 70s, and there were no more fervent fans of a team in any sport than Raiders fans. Like, that's all they wanted. They wanted someone who got them. And Charlie Finley did not get the people of Oakland and didn't even pretend to. And they responded in kind.
Wow. That's an amazing thing that horrified me reading the book. Like, they don't even have fan support. They're fighting amongst each other. And let me ask you something. Why do you think these group of guys were so volatile, not only against Finley, but amongst themselves?
Yeah, well, I think it's part and parcel of their success, honestly. There were so many leaders in that clubhouse, or guys who thought they were leaders in various ways, that no small misstep would go unnoticed. They held each other to a level of mutual accountability unlike any I've seen in 20 years of being a sports writer. On the field, off the field, it didn't matter. I mean, some of the stuff was trivial, but some of the stuff was actually baseball functionality. And they pushed that envelope so hard and so ferociously that they would cross the line occasionally. And egos would get bruised and fists would fly. But it was totally worth it in the long run because this was the best drilled team, the most cohesive team, the team that knew each other better than any other team. It's not like they were that much more talented than any of the teams they beat in the World Series. They just executed with that extra little level of precision that got them over. And if there's, one thing that kept them from splintering under all this duress, and Lord knows they had a lot of clubhouse fights, it was that ultimately, no matter how much they hated each other, they always hated Charlie Finley more. And that may have been intentional on his part, but I kind of doubt it. And even though he was never worried about making friends, he despite his best intentions, he kept that team from fracturing.
And you know something? I'm just going to say a historical note here. And, people think I'm nuts because I read 2 books a week. I mean, I got my master's in history. I'm a lawyer. I've gone to school for 32 years. But when I read that, just like you told me right now, that, they had, against each other, but they hated Finley more. It reminded me of the Chinese 1930s. They were fighting a civil war between the communists and the national government with Chiang Kai-shek. And here comes Japan. And Japan is like Charlie Finley. Invades and they're butchering the population, and the communists and the nationalists put their differences aside and held together to help drive the Chinese out by the end of the war, which of course came in 1945. But when I saw this, I said, this is no different than any political stuff that I've read about. I said, Finley, with all of his, madness, kept the team together by everyone hating him. Hey, we have a common goal: win and hate Finley.
Yeah, absolutely. It's funny. I've had, as I tour the book, I've had a lot of people ask me whether, I'm reminded of a certain guy sitting in the Oval Office right now in relation to Charlie Finley. But I've never had anyone say that Finley reminds them of Japan.
Yeah,
that's a good one.
Yeah, it's gonna. But you know something? It really got ugly in the clubhouse. And one of the fights I want to address is Rollie Fingers and John Blue Moon Odom. That was ugly, and he mentioned his wife, Fingers' wife, who was getting a divorce. Let's see how that played out and what happened.
Yeah, it really goes a long way toward explaining this club, or at least illustrating this club. It was the workout day, the day before the 1974 World Series. Like, this is a time when teams are supposed to be focused and preparing. They're about to play their biggest games of the season. They're in Dodger Stadium. They're walking in. Blue Moon Odom says to Rollie Fingers, he brings up the marital issues Fingers is having. He and his wife Jill had been having issues for months, like pretty bad issues, to the point where Fingers actually had to address it with manager Alvin Dark, saying, look, I know things are crazy at home. It's not going to affect me on the field. The needling, the incessant needling the team did on every topic eventually wore Fingers down on this one, and he had to make a clubhouse announcement saying, look, this has to be off limits. This is too personal for me. It's too painful. I'm having a hard time dealing with it, so lay off. And people did lay off, except for Blue Moon Odom. So they're walking in. Odom brings up the topic of divorce. Fingers says, Moon, you can't even spell divorce. Odom says, yeah, but your wife can. That was the beginning of it. They make their way into the clubhouse. Fingers is getting dressed. Odom calls out from across the room, hey, Rollie, do you need any extra tickets for tomorrow's game? Rollie doesn't know where Odom's going with this, so he says, no, thank you, John, I've had enough. All right, I have enough. Odom says, I thought you might need one for your wife's boyfriend.
Love it.
And that's it. His finger snaps. He jumps off his stool. He races across the clubhouse. He takes a laundry cart, a rolling laundry cart that they use to collect the dirty towels and clothes and whatnot. He shoves it at Odom. It crashes into Odom's ankle. Fingers follows it by knocking Odom down with the forearm. Odom ends up. Odom's not a big guy, and he's probably 5'10", very lean, but unbelievably athletic. The guy is incredibly strong, and he never backed down from a fight ever. Like, he probably fought with all the A's at one point or another. And he threw Rollie across the room. Fingers fell backwards into a locker, cracked his head open on a clothes hook. Blood is spilling all over the floor. Odom's limping around from the cart crashing into his ankle. The visiting clubhouse attendant can't believe what he's seeing. He runs down the hall screaming, oh, my God, they're killing each other. There's blood everywhere. And this is how the A's prepared for the World Series. I mean, Fingers had to go to the hospital and get his head stitched up. Odom ended up on crutches. Yet there they were the next day. Fingers was as sharp as ever. Odom ended up pitching, and then they beat the Dodgers in 5 games.
And you know something? You segued some of these questions I was going to hold, but I think it's appropriate to address now. 2 things about 74. Number one, Dick Williams left because, of course, we'll talk about it in another 5 minutes. Alvin Dark didn't get the respect of his players until well into the season. And although they were 2-time champions, so it's almost a dual question. They were 2-time world champions. The Dodgers gave no respect either, in addition to what happened here. Yeah,
the Dodgers had some pretty healthy egos. And, to a degree, it was all justifiable. I mean, they did not end up as Hall of Famers, but in 1974, it looked like the entire roster was on a Hall of Fame track. They were just world beaters. They were so good. And they were not any more scared of the A's than the A's were scared of them. They were just more vocal about it to the press. And that kind of, at least a couple members, not the entire roster, but it only takes a couple members. Bill Buckner was a cocky guy. Reliever Mike Marshall was a cocky guy, and they weren't shy about talking. And that really rankled the A's and provided extra motivation. But like you say, yeah, Dick Williams had left. He could not take any more of Charlie Finley for a variety of reasons, to the point where in the victorious clubhouse, after Game 7 of the 1973 World Series, as champagne literally was flying around him, he quit on the spot. That's how through he was. And Finley turned around. He waited until spring training was about to start before he hired Alvin Dark for the second time, based primarily on Dark's subservience. I mean, he had become born again, religious, believed strongly in, serve thy master. And that included, kowtowing to his boss. And whatever Charlie wanted, Charlie got in Dark's eyes. And he took over the team and kind of ran it into the ground for half a season until everyone found their footing, including himself. He ended up making some great baseball moves down the stretch. I mean, he really did have a remarkable baseball mind, and led them to their third straight championship.
And do you think? Let me ask you this in your research, because you're a Giants guy, as I mentioned, and you've done so much fantastic research. I just can't begin to tell the listeners, the unabridged version would be 9-something pages, but what's the difference between the Alvin Dark in the early 1960s when he has all the Latino players and he's alienating his prejudice, and now he's on the 74, a mixed crew, including Bando and others that are Latino? What's the difference between Alvin Dark of old and Alvin Dark of new?
Religion is a big part of it. He found the Lord between his managerial stint with the Giants in the early 60s and taking over the A's in the mid-70s. And it's difficult to say if or how that tempered whatever racism he had. And I need to give the qualification that I don't think Dark was racist in a mean way. I mean, he was raised in Louisiana in the 30s. I think it was just ingrained in him to the point where, Reggie Jackson came off the DL and was a designated hitter for a few days while his leg healed because he couldn't play the field, but he wanted to hit. Bando wanted to do the same thing later. He wasn't ready to play the field. He wanted to be DH. Dark wouldn't let him. Jackson asked Dark why. Dark says, well, between you and me, we both know that black boys heal faster than white boys. That's a direct quote.
Yeah.
So it's not, there's no hatred in it, but it's still like weird ingrained bigotry. And everyone could see that. And no one really liked it, but they dealt with it, as best they could. Also, the big difference, in 1962, Dark was a terrifically angry guy. He could fly off the handle at any miscue by his team, to the point where he once flung a stool across the clubhouse, but his pinky had lodged into one of the braces before he let go of it, and he ripped the tip of his own finger off. So he found God at some point in the interim, and that helped his anger. He was no longer an angry guy at all. He meditated on Scripture a lot and talked about God a lot. And the players didn't necessarily appreciate all the God talk, but there was no question that it had helped him temperamentally. So he at least had that going for him.
Let me ask you this. He knew of the success of the A's, and of course there were other managers in the fray as well. And he knew there was a core group of players, and he knew the fiery, managerial, stance that Dick Williams took. Was he daunted to take over the role as manager?
It's possible. I mean, he really part of the problem in the early going was that he laid back. He saw this is a two-time defending champion. They've got their ways about them, and he let a bunch of things play out. One of the big criticisms against him was a lack of institutional authority. He didn't hold players accountable, thinking these are champions, they know how to handle their business, they'll handle it themselves. And they didn't. And things went off the rails in a number of ways until somewhere past midseason, Dark finally put his foot down and said, look, I tried to let you guys run it your way. You're not respecting me. You're not playing good baseball. Things have to change. And he earned some respect with that. And by the end of the season, the pitchers never really liked him. He didn't handle the pitchers the way they wanted to be handled. He pulled them out too early. He ended up costing Vida Blue his first win of the season by pulling him out before the fifth inning, even though he was pitching well. So he never really earned the respect of many of the pitchers. But overall, the guys took to him, and they understood that he was doing a more than creditable job.
And let me ask you this question about And I'm not going to ask the same old question, but I'm going to question you on the Mike Andrews affair in the World Series of '73. And here we're playing the Mets, and it's New York. And, of course, they beat the Big Red Machine, who was a superior team. Now you're playing already the Oakland A's, former world champion. But with Mike Andrews, real simple. He dropped 2 balls in the game, and Finley's like, I want you to show that you're hurt, you can't play, this is never going to happen again. And when, word got out, everyone was going crazy. The Met fans, the Oakland, and that was the final straw that put Dick Williams on. We know this. Why didn't Bowie Kuhn come down on Finley like he did with Steinbrenner in his dealings with Nixon? But everyone, and that wasn't even a baseball issue back then. That was just him saying, all of you got to contribute to a fund, and that fund went to Nixon. Why didn't he suspend Finley? That was collusion. That was against baseball policy.
Yeah, well, it's a good question. I mean, he tried to disable Mike Andrews to get minor league second baseman Manny Trio onto the roster because once Andrews is on the roster, he can't leave except in case of injury. So he invented an injury for him. Kuhn did reinstate Andrews above Finley's objections, and he did end up fining Finley after the season. He fined him, I think, $5,000, which at the time was considerable as far as baseball fines went. But your guess is as good as mine. I would think that it's early in Kuhn's tenure, or early-ish, and he's still finding his footing as far as dealing with intransigent owners. Maybe he learned a few things from dealing with Finley that helped him handle Steinbrenner in a way he thought appropriate. But I mean, Finley surprised Kuhn constantly with his outlandish behavior, and was constantly getting reprimanded by the commissioner's office for various things, and occasionally fined.
And you know something, he had a run-in already with Finley back in '72 during that whole Vita Blue episode. He comes on in '71. This kid is just like lightning. And then he's starting the All-Star game with Doc Ellis, and that's the first time 2 African-American pitchers are pitching. Now Vita wants more money, and, Philly turns out to be the real jackass he really is. And Kuhn had to intervene on this as well.
Yeah, like I said, once Finley saw a point that he thought gave him the moral high ground, he couldn't be budged from it, and he made Vita what he thought was a fair offer, which in turn actually was a fair offer. It would have been the highest salary ever paid to a second-year player, but Vita wanted more. He won the Cy Young and MVP awards the previous season, youngest player to win either, let alone both at the same time. He held out for more. Finley was content to let him sit out the entire season. Bowie Kuhn knew, as well as Finley did, 1 in every 12 tickets sold in the American League in 1971 was to see Vita Blue pitch. Opposing teams were running Vita Blue promotional days when the A's came to town. And Kuhn wanted to get this guy back on the field in the worst possible way, so he ordered Finley to make an offer and keep it open, and he ordered Blue to sign it, and everyone did so kind of miserably and went about their way. And Vita Blue went from a Cy Young and American League, Cy Young and MVP award in 1971 to winning 6 games in 1972. He was that bitter. And ultimately, Finley didn't care if he cost himself on the field, if he deprived his team of its best chance at winning because its best pitcher was not available. He didn't care if he cost himself at the gate because no one was coming to see Vita Blue because Vita Blue wasn't pitching. He wanted to be right, and he took every step he could to ensure that happened.
And let me ask you this about Vita Blue. As you know, in the 80s he was caught cocaine, everything. And when you interviewed him, and not the researcher did, was he using drugs, say, around a year after he came up? And again, you're talking about a 21-year-old. Do you think he was using drugs ever since all along, like he said, or do you think he just fabricates it? And, maybe that's why he wasn't the kind of pitcher he was in '71.
No, I don't think it's drugs at all. I think the drugs came later. It's funny. He actually lived in the housing projects in Oakland with Tommy Davis, A's outfielder Tommy Davis, who was with the team through 1971, and Jim Mudcat Grant, another African-American pitcher, lived with them for a time when he was with the A's. But Vita didn't find drugs there. It wasn't until he moved to Alameda, to kind of a Tony moneyed neighborhood that he was introduced to drugs. But that came a couple years later.
That's unbelievable. Now, let me ask you this. You know, Finley, before there was a Steinbrenner and the manager-changing game, Finley was the same way. I think Hank Bauer was the manager for a season, if I'm not mistaken.
Hank Bauer was a manager twice. He and Alvin Dark were both hired, fired, and then rehired.
Yeah, and I think they brought in Joe DiMaggio in the late 60s to give hitting help. Why Dick Williams? This guy turned the 67 Red Sox around, a team that was not supposed to lose at least 90 games like they did before. He came in, smoothed out, the 67 Red Sox, began Red Sox Nation. I just did a whole show on living up here. Dick Williams is like a hero because, like the Oakland A's, Red Sox were getting $4,000 or $5,000 attendance to the Fenway Park. They weren't really interested in a bad team anymore. But now Dick Williams had a reputation. And Finley, being the narcissistic person he was, why Dick Williams?
Williams had the reputation of being tough, and that's what the A's needed. I mean, the players themselves admit it. Like, they were a talented bunch before Williams came along, but he drilled them on the little things, on the fundamentals, which ended up being the difference between, winning and losing in the World Series. And Gene Tennis told me he showed up at spring training in 1971, and he took the bats away. He wouldn't let us hit until we could run, bunt drills and wheel plays and coverages until we had that all down cold. Then we could get to the rest of baseball. And those A's were the best drilled team in the major leagues. The problem with Dick Williams, and it didn't have time to manifest with the A's, was that he was an authoritarian, and he was a hard ass, and his ways would tend to grate on his clubhouses, which spelled the end of his tenure in Boston. He was great at getting a lot out of his team, but maintaining that was more of an issue. Finley was okay with it. Williams would put up with the incessant phone calls. That's part of the secret of his duration in Oakland. He's the only guy Finley didn't fire in less than 2 years, is because he tolerated Finley's meddling. Finley wasn't just his own general manager. He called constantly. Like he called Williams at home in the morning, at night after games. Williams' office phone was ringing when he came off the field after games. Finley put him in a suite with a traveling secretary on the road to make sure that someone was always there to answer the phone. Once he called the dugout all the time, but once Williams was so through with the dugout calls that he had trainer Joe Romo answer the phone and told him to say, "I'm not here." So Williams was able to handle that relatively graciously, and I'm guessing that's one reason why Finley was fond of him. And then, of course, winning was another big reason.
Now, there's a dichotomy with Finley. And let me ask you this. He loaned Catfish Hunter money to go buy the farm and stuff like that, and Hunter had a hard time paying him back. He thought, Finley, he was being very generous to his players, including beautiful rings for the 72 World Series championship, lavish parties. Do you agree with that sentiment that Finley, when he felt like it, can do these lavish things and brighten up the players with his generosity?
No question. I mean, there's a litany of things he did that were incredibly generous. The most noteworthy being, Finley was a canny stock player. Like he made his fortune in insurance, but he increased his fortune substantially by picking stocks. And he made an offer to his players that he would invest on their behalf whatever portion of their salaries they wanted. And he made it a money-back guarantee. If the stocks he picked tanked, he would still give all their money back. And that was in the days when guys were making $20,000. That was an incredible boon. So he did all that stuff. He got full-size replica trophies of the World Series trophy for every player after the 72 World Series. The story being that, when Catfish Hunter made his first major league start, Finley propped up the telephone next to the radio, called Hunter's parents in rural North Carolina and said, listen to it as long as you want. I mean, long-distance phone bills be damned. He did lots of stuff, but it was always with an eye toward maintenance of his own ego. Doing nice things for his players put him squarely in charge. And that it became obvious, and players were happy to accept his generosity and were appreciative of his generosity. to a point because they always knew there was some karmic debt to be collected later. And ultimately, after the Mike Andrews thing, all his players turned on him. They slagged him up and down to the New York media as this was going on, and he soured. And that was the point at which every ounce of generosity he had showed to that point went out the window, and the team began traveling poorly and staying in crummy hotels, and they had to pay their own postage for outgoing mail at the Coliseum, which meant if they wanted to respond to fan letters, they had to foot the bill. And if they wanted to include a promotional headshot with those responses, they had to foot the bill for that. Like, everything went away. And then from that point on, it was almost open warfare between the players and him, and it never recovered.
And let me ask you this. I'll ask you one final question because we are getting on with time. Do you believe that 1972 World Series is one of the best World Series ever in World Series history?
Oh, sure. I mean, Lord knows I've studied it more closely than almost any other World Series, so I'm a little bit biased. But yeah, the drama of this underdog Oakland team going into Cincinnati to take on the nascent version of the Big Red Machine, which had most of the pieces in place, was remarkable. And Gene Tennis played under a death threat, and then Tennis hit his 4 home runs and won MVP after having not even been a starter for the entire season up till September. He hit 5 home runs in the regular season and 4 home runs in the World Series. It was remarkable drama, and really set the tone for those A's. They went in not knowing what they could do. They actually believed the hype. They thought they were going to get killed, but they stole the first game and suddenly got a little self-belief and managed to do it in 7. It was a great series.
And you know what? I went back to take a look at the highlights, and I always forget. And I read it in your book, and I saw it. I kept zooming in Joe Rudy's catch. Unbelievable, unbelievable.
And one of my favorite moments from the interview process was Rudy telling me about. I mean, Rudy was drafted as a first baseman, and in the late '60s, A's manager Bob Kennedy realized his best shot to make the team was as an outfielder. And so they started drilling him as an outfielder. And the guy he got to do the drilling was Joe DiMaggio in his 2 years as a de facto A's coach. DiMaggio had been hired as a vice president by Finley because he lived in the Bay Area. And it turns out DiMaggio needed a couple years of active service to qualify for his full pension, so he was willing to sign up. And then Finley never assigned him a desk or any actual VP work to do, so he suited up and served as a coach. And he helped Rudy turn into what many people consider the best left fielder in the game. I mean, he worked incessantly on these drills where Kennedy would shoot balls over his head with an air cannon. And Rudy would go back, and DiMaggio would be right there instructing him. And he ran this drill all through spring training, and when he was called up to the team in May, all through the season, and it never stopped. And he became an amazing left fielder. And all of that came into play in this one ball hit by Dennis Menke that could have well turned the series. Rudy went back and made an amazing catch against the wall, just like DiMaggio had showed him, and it really brought everything full circle.
Let me ask you this. Am I forgetting something that maybe you want to discuss that maybe I haven't discussed?
There's so many details about this team. We could talk about more details for another 3 hours.
I'll tell you what. Go ahead.
No, you hit on a bunch of big major topics. It's always fun to talk.
Well, you know what? I want you back on the show because I think that we need to do a part 2 with this. And what I'll do is I'll send an email probably after the show, and we'll do a part 2 because I can't stop talking about the A's. Hold the line. This is how I end the show, and then I'll talk to you for 30 seconds after I end it. Folks, as you can see, this is such an exciting topic. Go out. Get the book, Dynastic, Bombastic, Fantastic, Reggie, Rollie, Catfish, and Charlie Finley, Swingin' A's. You can find it at Amazon and I'm sure almost every bookstore in America, right, Jason?
Anywhere fine books are sold, and might I also add that I am tweeting at Dynastic Book a day-by-day account of all 3 championship series, seasons. It's a fun way to keep up with what was happening then.
Well, it's also a good way to lure book readers into teasing them. Say, hey, that's interesting. Maybe I buy the book.
There you go.
You see, Charlie Finley rubbed off on you. So hang on the line, folks. Go out, get this book. As always, I'm Ian Kahanowitz. A special thank you for Jason Turbow to be on this show today. I am honored to have you on this show. And in the immortal words of Edward R. Murrow, good night, folks. Good luck. We'll see you next time.